lecture entitled Governmentality from 1978. And then I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about a review article by Thomas Pepinsky and his colleagues on bureaucracy and service delivery. This is the only chapter that has governmentality as its title. And although I think the word appears a few more times, but still it looms very large in Foucault studies, especially studies of the latter Foucault. Right? So he starts out by saying, in a previous lecture on apparatuses of security, I tried to explain the emergence of a set of problems specific to the issue of population. On closer inspection, it turned out that we would also need to take into account the problematic of government. In short, one needed to analyze the series: security, population, government. I would now like to begin making an inventory of this question of government. So he starts out here talking about what shifted in Europe from classical antiquity through the Middle Ages to the early modern period, one might call it, or the late medieval period in Europe, beginning, say, in the 13th century, moving forward, something that is also documented by the Cambridge political philosopher Quentin Skinner in a series of writings about princes who were starting to take the stage of governing their principalities. And these were becoming increasingly complex, not so much in terms of size. Some of them were considerable, but others not so much. But in terms of how they now had to play a much more active role in governing. And governing meant many things. The proper conduct, the exercise of power, the means of securing the acceptance and respect of his subjects, the love of God and obedience to him, the application of divine law to the cities of men, and so on. Right? So Foucault starting to say that this movement into this kind of thinking was relatively significant. Maybe it was also relatively new, or perhaps there had been other moments in European and other histories, right, where you find similar kinds of interest, motivation. My own reading of this in ancient India is that possibly was very significant around the time of the Guptas. Right? The Gupta age is also the age of territory, where the birth of territory was perhaps a few centuries earlier, but this is when in India that you start to see more and more princes, more and more rajas. And I had mentioned this to you in a previous lecture, that rajas would be given certain, or identified and given in forest areas, large tracts of land that they were sort of in charge of. And this usually would come from the Chakravartin, the Gupta emperor, right? So, but I mean, this wasn't restricted just to the Guptas, but it sort of was, one might say, invented there, the kind of granting of territory. The marking of territory is a Mauryan trait, right? But the Ashoka's pillars and edicts come to mind, but this was something else. And this meant, the more you had lands handed out, the more you needed the art of governing. And the Arthashastra, which sort of gets perfected around this period, the Gupta period, maybe almost fully written then as well. We don't really have good evidence of whether it started its early drafts with Chandragupta Maurya and Kautilya, who was his supposed minister, or if that was just the initial attribution. Although Patrick Oliver, I'm sorry to be going off in various directions, but this is fascinating to me in many different senses. Right? The birth of the modern state is also the birth of the territorial state, and its emergence, its subsequent transformation took on different hues and syndromes in different parts of the world. But I find it fascinating that especially in the second millennium, we have almost a kind of a convergence to singular forms. And certainly by the 18th, 19th century, this becomes almost uniform. Right? Why is it that we have almost identical social structures that make up state systems around the world? It is perhaps a happy coincidence, but it also sort of gives us pause to understand the movements. Right? And that's really one of the most important reasons why I like reading Foucault's narratives about Europe, not because identical things happened elsewhere in the world, but because they give us modes of investigation of these transformations. And we do know that around the colonial period, but even starting before it, say in the Mughal era and prior to that, and I'm arguing perhaps as early as the Guptas, you start to see similar patterns, making that convergence later on much easier to take place, similar patterns that take place. I'm going to sort of skip through this quickly until he comes to Machiavelli, and he says Machiavelli's prince was, so again, 16th century, 15th century, at the end of the culmination, one might say, of other mirror of princes, advice to princes types of studies. And although the current reading of Machiavelli's Prince might be that it is a kind of a, if not a parody, a kind of a critique of that entire genre. Right? The Prince is a very complex document that I have great difficulty in fully assimilating. I have read many different readings about it, and I'm still, puzzled when I approach the text. Foucault very quickly points out that by the time Machiavelli re-emerged in the 19th century, there was a lot that had changed, not just in the world, but also in the discourses around kingship or rule. So one important way in which the Prince was distinct from, say, the Arthashastra was that even though it was a guide to governing, it was a guide to governing that was shorn of the need for a certain kind of a divine sanction, right? So the Prince acted on his own. He was guided by his virtu, his own personhood, his own freedom, one might say, and his circumstances, the chances in his life, his luck, fortuna. Once you remove the divine right of kings, the Prince stands in no necessary natural relationship to his principality. Right? The link that binds him to his principality may have been established through violence, through family heritage, or by treaty, with the complicity or the alliance of other princes. This makes no difference. The link remains, in any event, a purely synthetic one. There is no fundamental, essential, natural, and juridical connection between the prince and his principality. Now, this is something that frightened a lot of people, right? Because then it suddenly sort of laid the legitimacy of the prince into question. Prince was just one arbitrary person among many possible ones who could be prince. He had no divine sanction. He had no other natural right to be the singular person who headed the sovereign. One of the most important discourses that leads out of this slightly scary view of the prince being sort of left in this fragile condition of inheriting or working without divine sanction or any other kind of authority, legitimate authority over a new principality, which is what the whole intent of the prince is about, is this complementary issue of having to deal with the people who inhabit that very place. Right? And so Foucault very nicely points out how the discourses that came out of the prince, while sort of being aware of this crisis, right, they implicitly or otherwise opposed, they were opposed to this anchorless type of idea, and instead turned the prince into a series of starting points for thinking about the arts of government, right? And so a whole series of texts that start to appear and discourses that come up are around this question of how do we deal with these populations, these people, right? And what are the different forms of decentralized governance that are already taking place that must be cultivated, starting with the family, starting with the school and other institutions, the church, and so on, that keep the process of government at all levels going. So in other words, government is seen as the right disposition of things, arranged so as to lead to a convenient end. Convenient for whom? For the governors of that society, as it were. This means that the end of sovereignty is the exercise of sovereignty. The good is obedience to the law, hence the good for sovereignty is that people should obey it. Leading to a theory of the art of government, which was linked from the 16th century onwards to the whole development of an administrative apparatus of territorial monarchies, the emergence of governmental apparatuses. It was also connected to a set of analyses and forms of knowledge that began to develop in the late 16th century and grew in importance during the 17th. So the emergence of statistics, of measurement of populations, is part of this kind of art of government, the arts of government, that directly or indirectly came out of the sphere of an anchorless loss of sanction form of government. Monarchies, to be sure, but ones that needed to be guided before it was too late. Right? So it was through the development of the science of government that the notion of economy came to be recentered onto the different plane of reality that we now characterize as the economic, and it was also through the science that it became possible to identify problems specific to the population. So Foucault goes through a whole series of arguments around this very formation of government, and as you can tell, the logic of this sequence of governmentality, these arts of government, ought to become clear from stemming out of this sudden anxiety that a modern view of politics had brought upon discourses. So as promised, the next paper I want to discuss is this one by Thomas Pepinsky and his colleagues. It's called Bureaucracy and Service Delivery. And clearly this is something that is quite different from the paper that we just looked at, Foucault's paper on governmentality. Here, what Pepinsky and his colleagues are doing is, let's look at the abstract very quickly. This article reviews the literature on the politics of bureaucracy in the developing world with this focus on service delivery and bureaucratic performance. We survey classic topics and themes such as the developmental state, principal-agent relations, and the efficient Greece hypothesis. Right? And so what this paper is looking at is in some ways the kind of the set of processes that Foucault would call well-established modes of governmentality. So Foucault's paper, in a sense, is meta-theoretical, in a way, one might say, where he is first of all looking at what has happened to the reasons of state. Right? What are the sort of justifications for the state that start to turn somewhat complicated once Machiavelli provides this type of spiritless state. What Machiavelli's prince did, and this is something that Foucault is not certainly the first to point out, but nevertheless has been in the minds of many political scientists, at least since the 16th century, the question of where is the reason of state? The reason of state as a kind of either having some kind of divine sanction or other sort of form of legitimacy starts to disintegrate with Machiavelli's prince. And instead, what students of politics began to focus on was what are the mechanisms through which governance itself takes place and what are the ways in which it can be effective. So in a sense, bypassing the very legitimacy of the founding of the state is one that affects desacralization of the state. So this type of shift in thinking about the state has brought us to a point where we are now looking more and more on the science of doing government. Right? And so, what is the nitty-gritty of governing itself? How does governance take place, and so on. So the paper begins as follows. Scholars of comparative politics have made impressive strides in understanding political institutions, voting, and political participation in developing countries. But most politics is not electoral politics, and the vast majority of experiences that citizens have in the state are not electoral in nature. The face of politics for most citizens instead is a bureaucrat. The interactions between citizens and bureaucrats, both the nature of the interactions themselves and their results, have consequences for mass political behavior, trust in government, state legitimacy, and the functionings of bureaucracies. So, in other words, Pepinsky and his colleagues are trying to understand what they go on to term street-level bureaucrats and their interaction with citizens. So if you want to start with bureaucracy, you must start with Max Weber. So rightly, they say two figures who occupy a central position in modern work on bureaucracies are Max Weber and James Q. Wilson. Weber's Economy and Society characterizes many of the quintessential features of the ideal typical bureaucracy. That is, esteem, professionalization, hierarchical organization, task, routinization, and the impersonalization of bureaucratic authority. Although Weber considered professional bureaucracies to be essential for modern states, he also recognized that bureaucracies were political creations with internal politics. The other major figure in this domain is James Q. Wilson, and his book, Bureaucracy, What Government Agencies Do and Why They Do It, embeds bureaucracies in their political context, explaining why bureaucracies are so often characterized by red tape and inefficiencies that markets and firms would never tolerate. In Wilson's words, quote, government bureaucracies are more bureaucratic than industrial ones, in large part because we, the people and our political representatives, insist that they be so. So the themes that come out of Wilson's and Weber's work are ideas of the developmental state, good governance, and principal-agent relationships. So Pepinsky and colleagues say, the introduction of a relatively professional, meritocratic, and efficient administrative structure was a critical factor in the rapid development of East Asia, including Japan, Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. Right? So what happened right until 1998 was enormous growth rates for these countries, and that led to these countries being called Asian tigers. And there's been a lot of literature on what happened that led to this, but also what happened to the subsequent Asian financial crisis. Although the exact role the state played in guiding the economy varied across these states, the two distinguishing features of East Asia's developmental bureaucracies were A, meritocratic recruitment of knowledgeable bureaucrats and network ties to the business community, and B, the overall coherence of the bureaucracy. Something about the professionalization of the bureaucracy seemed to play an extremely important role in promoting the economic development of these countries. So it goes on to talk about this classic Mitty and the Japanese Miracle book from 1982 by Johnson, which explicates the developmental state argument using the example of Japan's successful economic model. So Japan had an agency called Mitty, and this promoted technology development and its deployment in Japan in a very, very structured, organized sort of way. And state institutions helped to obtain the needed capital investment for industry. Bureaucrats in turn rewarded firms that performed well and sanctioned firms that did not meet strict performance standards. Right? Johnson does not invoke Weber as the foundation for his conception of bureaucracy. His understanding of the bureaucracy is essentially Weber. Subsequent work, which builds on and is also somewhat critical of the Weberian and Wilson framework on bureaucracy, such as this one, The Developmental State by Meredith Wu Cummings, argues that the politics and economics of development states matters. Right? Coley argues that the structure of political competition drives bureaucracy and performance and ties us ultimately to the varieties of colonial experience. These works share common refrains: A, all bureaucracies are political, and B, efficacious bureaucracies are never completely insulated from society, but C, such bureaucracies do not become mere tools either of the politicians or of private interests. So you start to see the bureaucracy in these empirical studies as itself carrying on certain traditions, but also having some emergent effects and having a certain political position and stance of their own. There's also work that by Daniel Kaufman from the World Bank Institute, for instance, that is really looking at the quality of governance, so the quality of bureaucratic institutions. Right? A deeper problem is that bureaucratic structures are both endogenous and highly correlated with other potential political sources of economic performance. Identifying the causal effects of bureaucracies, even assuming away the problem of measuring their characteristics, is a hard problem. So the author says that both the developmental state literature and the quality of government literature are characterized by a focus on macro level measures and outcomes. So really talking at the unit of the state, right? And so they tend to target national policies and organized public and political interests, which have only indirect effects on most citizens. Moreover, although work on the developmental state is useful for understanding the development of national capacity in macroeconomic and industrial policy making, it rarely engages challenges of service delivery in, for example, healthcare or education in the developing world. As such, it only captures one, albeit important, facet of bureaucratic politics and performance. So the next set of studies that this paper looks at is a large class of principal-agent types of studies, right? Coming out of behavioral economics and game theory. Okay, so let's pause and take a look at what this term principal-agent problem refers to. It refers to a person named principal, the person who requires some task to be accomplished, and an agent who is charged with accomplishing that task, who actually going out and doing that task, right? So in this cartoon, you can see that the person on the left, the boss, is the principal, and this person is the agent. But unfortunately, the principal isn't able to monitor everything that the agent does, and the agent is often free to sort of do his own, her own thing, right? Now, you can also see what kinds of effects arise out of a principal-agent problem. And one of them, of course, is that the principal feels overburdened with trying to continuously monitor what the agent or agents are doing. Here you see a different type of situation termed moral hazard. And this situation typically works like this. An entity, an agency, a firm, or person takes a risk and gets an enormous reward after having taken that risk. But if he or she fails, or that firm fails, then the government or some other entity steps in and bails out that person or firm, right? So if you win, you win. If you lose, you still don't lose fully, but you have some winnings. So back to the text. On principal-agent problems, the authors say, quite distinct from the development state literature, another large literature addresses the internal operation of bureaucracies and their interaction with elected political officials. In particular, Weber's view of the bureaucracy as a hierarchical organization with top-down delegation and monitoring of tasks to subject matter experts has proven quite amenable to theoretical investigations within a principal-agent framework, which I just described a minute or so ago. In political science and economics, this has become the dominant theoretical lens to understand bureaucracies. Right? The authors go on to describe what classical principal-agent problems look like, and they typically capture the hierarchical interaction between a principal and an agent, for example, between an elected official and a whole bureaucracy, or between a supervisor and a frontline civil servant. And there's a lot of work that's been done on principal-agent problems, usually modeled using some kind of game theoretical framework, but there's increasingly also a lot of empirical work around what's known as experimental game theory or behavioral economics. And I'm going to skip through some of these very, very interesting results that come out of these studies, but I hope you will go through them. One of the points that I do want to make, though, is that principal-agent problems have typically been studied with, in the field of corruption studies. And here again, there are some very interesting outcomes from these studies, but also several problems. For instance, although studies of corruption have benefited from principal-agent models for understanding the behavior of corrupt agents, Callan et al. From 2014 also point out that corruption in the public sector is often embedded in larger clientistic machine politics, whose dynamics are not captured solely by narrow principal-agent problems. Indeed, this is one of the biggest problems with principal-agent modes of investigation, in that they assume a certain kind of methodological individualism, or rather they apply methodological individualism as the main technique for studying these types of problems, and don't take into account social and broader dynamical effects. What the authors are indeed most interested in is what they call street-level bureaucracies and the understanding of street-level bureaucracies, right? So street-level bureaucrats are the public sector workers, including teachers, police officers, social workers, public lawyers, and nurses, who interact directly with citizens and who implement policy on the ground. Given the nature of street-level bureaucracies, they represent a useful case to interrogate the bureaucratic politics of service delivery in the developing world. Like all civil servants, street-level bureaucrats enjoy discretion in policy implementation, but street-level bureaucrats are distinct from others because they are the final step in the chain of policy implementation. So really what the authors are pointing to are, who do citizens actually interact with? What do those interactions look like? How are they shaped by prevailing social conditions and cultural conditions, right? What sorts of political as well as economic considerations enter into those types of negotiations? And these aren't things that can be typically understood through conceptual or theoretical arguments or models, but rather need to be investigated through detailed ethnographic and other embedded types of studies. So this notion of embeddedness is very important in this type of work, and one of the pioneers in the field is Mark Granovetter, who used the concept of embeddedness to refer to the social relationships that influence an individual's economic decisions. We use the concept to refer to the social relationships that influence civil servants' actions. So let's take a brief pause here and listen to what Mark Granovetter has to say about embeddedness.
In the paper starts out by saying, suppose people, what would economic life be like if people didn't have social relationships? And I said, well, that's a thought experiment. It's a thought experiment that is very hard to accomplish because people always do have social relationships. But if you look at the way people have analyzed the economy, they have tended to go in two different directions. Either they have taken what I call the under-socialized approach, which is typical of classical and modern economics, which is that people are basically pursuing their own self-interest and their social relationships don't matter. All that matters is what they're doing in the economy. So that's under-socialized. But then there was a sociological view, which is that people's activities in the economy or anywhere else were completely regulated by the norms and values they had acquired from their socialization, from their childhood, from their people around them. And that's what Dennis Wrong had called, another sociologist had called, the over-socialized conception of man in modern sociology. And I said in this paper, look, you might think these are opposites, and one has people that are completely out for themselves and are not paying any attention to anything else. Another has people who are completely in the completely under the control of these norms and values that they've absorbed from the larger society. But there's a funny sense in which these two extreme views coincide with one another, in the sense that they both ignore people's social relationships. And once you take people's social relationships into account, you get a different picture of the economy, because a lot of what happens in the economy happens through social relationships. People carry out a lot of their economic activities through social relationships. And once you take that into account, and I called that embeddedness, I said that people are, people's economic activity is embedded in their networks of social relations, and that whether or not people can trust each other, which is a big problem in any economic set of outcomes, depends on what kind of social network and social relationships they have. One thing I didn't say that people often make the mistake of attributing to me or attributing to economic sociology is that people's social relationships always lead them to trust one another. This is a mistake. I mean, whether there is trust is a complicated issue. Depends on how the network of social relationships is set up. In fact, it's very important to keep in mind that when you trust other people, you are much more vulnerable than if you didn't. So that the fact that you have a social relationship with someone may make you think that you can trust them and you don't have to pay attention to what they're doing. But if the other person has bad intentions toward you, as sometimes is the case, we talk about the so-called confidence rackets, where people simulate interest in you and simulate social relationships so that they can deceive you. So that when you have a social relationship and when you trust another person, then you're much more vulnerable to them than if they were strangers, because then you would be wary. So it's not an automatic thing that you have trust because you have social networks. But it did seem to me that the argument that Williamson made in Markets and Hierarchies failed because he didn't take into account, he just assumed that everyone interacting with one another in the economy were strangers to one another. And if that were the case, then it might be true that in order to reduce transaction costs, that when transactions got complicated, they would always have to be internalized into firms. But in fact, when you look at real markets, you see small independent firms carrying on very complicated transactions with one another. Silicon Valley, for example, or many high-tech regions are examples of that, or the so-called Third Italy, where these textile firms carry out very complicated relationships with one another. And the reason they can do that is because they have social networks of relationships connecting these firms and make it possible for them to interact with one another and resolve some of these problems that would otherwise occur. And so it seemed to me that you have to take that into account to get any kind of reasonable account of the economy.
So returning to the text, Granovetter, 1985, used the concept of embeddedness to refer to the social relationships that influence an individual's economic decisions. We use the concept to refer to the social relationships that influence civil servants' actions. Building on Granovetter's insights into the benefits of embeddedness for economic behavior, authors such as the following suggest that street-level bureaucrats who are embedded in the communities in which they serve produce better policy outcomes, right? So this is a line of thought that has excited many ethnographers recently. Veena Das has written about this very evocatively in the Indian context. Akhil Gupta wrote a whole book about it. There's also Olivier de Sardin. These are not authors that are cited in this paper, unfortunately, but please look them up. I think Gupta is, but not the others. So the point that Granovetter makes in his in the video that you just watched and in his book and papers is relevant here, that we shouldn't overplay this idea of embeddedness to mean that individuals and bureaucrats are completely socialized and those network ties are extremely important and that's what dominates the relationship. Nor should we assume that they're completely ignorant of each other and follow some kind of game theoretical framework, right? So embeddedness needs to be explored in specifically in culturally relevant contexts, and different conditions might change the forms of the types of processes and the outcomes that are associated with this type of embeddedness. And a lot of these studies are referring to, again, to multiple cases that demonstrate this fact. The next section is looking at embeddedness and its relationship with corruption and clientelism. I'm not going to be able to talk much about corruption here because that's a much larger topic. Clientelism, I want to take another short detour just to explain what that's about. So this somewhat extended detour that I want to take now is into this theme of clientelism, and I'm doing it for a very specific reason. I want to try and connect up this notion of embeddedness and street-level bureaucracy and the earlier term governmentality to a set of relationships that, to my mind, are extremely important in trying to understand the what we're calling the central actor networks that are kind of prominent in what one might call the state effect, right? So if the state is a set of performances and the state performance is something that we encounter in our everyday lives, then that's something we need to pay attention to, right? Because we see in it signs and relationships of power that have beyond them another set of performances whose, if not just one, a whole series of other interlinked sets of performances whose effects and understandings we have very little in connection with, right? In the kinds of theories and the frameworks that we generally apply in state theory, right? This concerns me greatly. This to me is a great travesty in the social sciences, to not be able to sort of see beyond these kind of dramas, little crises that we see erupting around particular state effects. But when we link them across a multiplicity of scales and we see their embeddedness in our everyday lives, right? What does this mean to our lifestyles? And our lifestyles, I would sort of take the kind of pathway that's been offered to us by sociologists such as Norbert Elias and others, link up with conditions of life and our ways of living, right? The conditions of life are, in a sense, our social milieus, right? What we encounter when we act in the world, and ways of living within them are the modes that we are habitus, I should say, that's plural of habitus, right? Habitus which we see constantly being recreated in our own bodily dispositions. And these are very complex but dynamic and lived experiences that matter a great deal to us. And to us, they matter most of all because they correspond with certain life stories, tales that we tell ourselves, tales that we sort of want to emulate, right? So this is like the most foundational, if you will, phenomenological experiences that are connected through multiple forms of embeddedness to much larger narratives that affect us all in deeply political ways. So this interlude on clientelism, which I promised you a while earlier, begins with this wonderful cartoon, which is also the cover of Susan Stokes and her colleagues' book with clientelism in the title. And I just want to begin with this definition: proffering material goods in return for electoral support, where the criterion of distribution that the patron uses is simply, did you or will you support me, right? This is what how Susan Stokes defines clientelism, and that previous cartoon simply visualizes that process in an electoral system. Okay, so James C. Scott, again, an instrumental friendship in which An individual of higher socio-economic status, the patron, uses his own influence and resources to provide protection or benefits or both for a person of lower status, client, who for his part reciprocates by offering general support and assistance, including personal services to the patron. So a very a wonderful political science definition, which is crowded with a whole set of images around a patron-client relationships, right? So I'm going to skip through this part. I'm also going to place this on record on the website, so you will be able to go through the various slides on your own. But this is, standard practices we see in many different kinds of many different kinds of contexts, and Stokes and her colleagues also provide wonderful examples, right? So a campaign that focuses on the personal qualities of the candidate may invest in mass media appeals and rely on a highly centralized party structure. This is something so patent over the last century, at least, right, in various politics across the world, right? And never become starker in our current televisualized media culture, right? So an army of brokers to spy and vote, all of that is exactly what we might be familiar with. And again, the sort of variations of the clientelist framework that are worthy of note. And I'm going to stop here. Okay, back to the text. The same social networks that can put pressure on civil servants and elected officials to provide the goods and services to which they are entitled can also demand favors from civil servants. See Kaiser and Sachs. In many contexts, civil servants participate in what outsiders perceive as corruption, but might be viewed locally as reciprocal obligations of kinship and community. And these are by no means fixed cultural tropes or norms, and there's plenty of work. Akhil Gupta is a fine example of the kind of close ethnographic studies of these kinds of relationships, right? And James C. Scott has also very finely in Moral Economy of the Peasant and many other pieces like that described the modalities of these kinds of relationships, these obligations. Related to corruption and embeddedness, in community networks in many developing countries, clientelism and patronage are also quite pervasive. So I spent a little bit of time on some of these themes. I'm not going to dwell more here, but this question of the interaction of civil servants and citizens is relevant because one needs to understand what does this amount to, what happens out of these kinds of interaction. And again, whether positively or negatively, citizens evaluate government based in part on their interaction with frontline providers. The interaction between citizens and civil servants shapes citizens' willingness to voice grievances about the particular program, their perceptions of political efficacy, their willingness to participate in civic engagement and political action, and so on, right? So all of these are sort of actually work all through the chain. So that's why the discussion on clientelism that Susan Stokes provides, especially some of the examples she gives from Argentina, are very interesting and relevant to trying to understand these multiple scales and operations of such interactions between citizens and the government, right? There's also very rich literature, both fictional and non-fictional, around this. Just think of Kafka, for instance, but not just him. Let's finally go to the conclusions. What the authors are saying is, look, these are old questions of politics. How does politics operate in the real world, and what sort of common themes and contexts can we sort of develop around the array of scales and dimensions that are involved, right? What thinking about street level bureaucrats and bureaucracy entails is really bringing this back to the central question of lifestyles, and at least that is the way in which I would like to interpret all of these themes, right? So let me sort of end there, and we'll pick it up again in the discussion.